I never thought I'd be the kind of father who'd find himself in this situation. You know, the one where you're caught between wanting to be there for your kid and feeling like you're constantly walking on eggshells. But here I am, a 42-year-old dad in suburban America, trying to navigate the choppy waters of co-parenting with my ex-wife, Sarah. My son, Jake, is 16 now. He lives with Sarah most of the time, and I've got to tell you, it's been a challenge. Sarah's parenting style is, well, let's just say it's different from mine. She lets Jake do pretty much whatever he wants, whenever he wants. It's like she's afraid of setting boundaries, afraid of being the bad guy. And me? I'm painted as the villain every time I try to offer some guidance or structure. I remember when Jake was younger, how we used to spend weekends together building model airplanes or playing catch in the backyard. Those were simpler times. Now, it feels like I'm tiptoeing around, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid to be accused of thinking he's stupid or incapable of making his own decisions. It's not that I think Jake is stupid. Far from it. He's a bright kid with a quick wit and a knack for technology that leaves me in the dust. But he's still a teenager, still learning about the world and himself. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think he could use a little guidance. Is that so wrong? I've got 2 younger kids with my current wife, Emma. Lily is 8 and Max is 6. They're at that age where everything is an adventure, where a trip to the grocery store can be turned into an epic quest if you use your imagination right. Emma and we try to keep that spark alive, to nurture their sense of wonder. So when summer was winding down and school was looming on the horizon, we thought it would be nice to take a family trip to the mountains. A last hurrah before the grind of homework and after-school activities kicked in. And of course, we wanted Jake to come along. I called him up, trying to keep my voice casual, not wanting to sound too eager. "Hey, Jake," I said, "Emma and I are thinking of taking a trip to the mountains before school starts. Want to come along?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, weighing the pros and cons of spending time with his uncool dad and stepmom. "Are we camping?" he finally asked, a note of disdain in his voice. I knew Jake hated camping. The last time we'd tried, he'd spent the entire trip complaining about bugs and the lack of Wi-Fi. No camping, I assured him quickly. We're staying at a hotel. You know, beds, showers, the works. Another pause. Then, yeah, okay. I guess I could come. I felt a surge of excitement. It had been a while since we'd spent any real time together, and I was looking forward to it. Maybe this trip would be a chance to reconnect, to bridge the gap that seemed to be widening between us. The day of the trip arrived, and I picked Jake up from Sarah's house. He came out with a small backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I raised an eyebrow at his choice of footwear, flip-flops, but bit my tongue. I'd learned the hard way that questioning his choices usually led to an argument. As we drove to meet Emma and the kids, I tried to engage Jake in conversation. "So, any plans for the school year?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He shrugged, not looking up from his phone. "Not really. Just the usual, I guess." I nodded, searching for something else to say. "Well, if you need help with anything, homework, college applications, whatever, you know you can always ask me, right?" Jake looked up then, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. "Dad, I'm not stupid. I can handle my own stuff." I sighed inwardly. "I know you're not stupid, Jake. I just want you to know I'm here if you need me." The rest of the drive passed in relative silence, punctuated only by the occasional ping of Jake's phone. When we arrived at the hotel, Emma and the kids were already there, bubbling with excitement. Lily and Max ran to give their big brother a hug, and for a moment, Jake's cool facade cracked, and he smiled genuinely. We spent the first day settling in and exploring the area around the hotel. Jake mostly kept to himself, but he did join us for dinner, even engaging in a bit of conversation with his siblings. The next morning, we set out for a hike. I'd checked the weather forecast and knew it might be a bit chilly up in the mountains, so Emma and I had packed accordingly. Lily and Max were decked out in layers, with good walking shoes and rain jackets just in case. Jake, on the other hand, came down to the lobby in his shorts, t-shirt, and flip-flops. No jacket, no hoodie, not even a pair of proper shoes. I felt a twinge of frustration but reminded myself not to say anything. He'd made his choices, and I had to respect that, right? The hike started out fine. The trail was relatively easy at first, and Jake seemed to be enjoying the fresh air and scenery. But as we climbed higher, the terrain got rougher and the temperature dropped. I could see Jake starting to struggle, his flip-flops slipping on the rocky path. About halfway up, Jake stopped. "This sucks," he announced. "I'm going back to the car." I exchanged a look with Emma. "Are you sure?" I asked. "We're almost at the viewpoint. It's supposed to be really beautiful." Jake shook his head. "Nah, I'm good. I'll just wait in the car." I hesitated, torn between wanting him to experience the hike with us and not wanting to force him into something he clearly wasn't enjoying. In the end, I handed him the car keys. "Okay, if that's what you want. We'll be back in a couple of hours." As we watched Jake trudge back down the trail, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. I'd hoped this trip would be a chance for us to bond, to create some good memories. Instead, it felt like we were drifting further apart. The next day, we decided to go cliff jumping at a nearby lake. It was something Lily and Max had been looking forward to for weeks. When I mentioned it to Jake, he just shrugged. "Didn't bring any swim trunks," he said. I offered to buy him a pair at the small shop near the lake, but he declined. "Nah, I'll just watch," he said, not looking up from his phone. So while Emma, the kids, and I spent the afternoon leaping into the crystal clear water and laughing, Jake sat on the shore, alternating between scrolling through his phone and staring off into the distance with a bored expression. The rest of the trip followed a similar pattern. Jake spent most of his time in the hotel room, only joining us for meals and the occasional outing where he could wear his usual shorts and flip-flops. Every attempt I made to include him or suggest an activity was met with indifference or outright refusal. By the time we were packing up to leave, I was feeling pretty deflated. I'd had such high hopes for this trip, but it felt like a failure. As we drove back, Jake barely said a word, just plugged in his earphones and tuned out the world. I dropped Jake off at Sarah's house, watching as he disappeared inside without so much as a backward glance. With a heavy heart, I headed home, trying to focus on the good moments we'd had with Lily and Max rather than the disappointment I felt about Jake. I hadn't been home for more than an hour when my phone rang. It was Sarah, and from the moment I answered, I knew this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "What the hell, Tom?" she started, her voice sharp with anger. "Jake tells me he was bored out of his mind on this trip. He says he couldn't participate in anything. What kind of father takes his son on a trip where he can't even join in?" I felt a surge of frustration. "Sarah, Jake chose not to participate. He didn't pack properly for the activities we had planned. He brought flip-flops for a mountain hike and no swim trunks for the lake. I offered to buy him what he needed, but he refused." "Oh, so now you're blaming him?" Sarah's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Maybe if you'd told him what to bring." I cut her off. "You mean like the last time I sent him a packing list? When both of you berated me for treating him like an idiot who couldn't think for himself." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Sarah's brain working, trying to find a way to twist this back on me. But I wasn't done. "I'm sending you the texts from last time," I said, my fingers already working to forward the messages. "The ones where you and Jake told me off for daring to suggest what he might need for a trip. You can't have it both ways, Sarah. Either he's old enough to make his own decisions, or he needs guidance. Which is it?" I hit send on the texts and waited. The silence stretched out, becoming almost uncomfortable. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice tight. "I'll look at the texts," she said curtly, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, frustration, sadness, and a bone-deep weariness. How had we gotten here? When had trying to be a good father become such a minefield? Days passed, and I heard nothing from either Sarah or Jake. My texts went unanswered, my calls straight to voicemail. It was the silent treatment, a tactic I'd become all too familiar with over the years. As I sat on the back porch one evening, watching Lily and Max play in the yard, Emma came out and sat beside me. She didn't say anything, just took my hand and squeezed it gently. She knew what was going through my mind, knew the weight I was carrying. "You're a good father, Tom," she said softly. "To all of your children." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as I sat there, watching the sun set and feeling the warmth of Emma's hand in mine, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever find a way to bridge the gap with Jake. If there would ever come a time when we could just be father and son, without all the complications and misunderstandings. The chasm between us felt wide and deep, filled with years of missed opportunities and unspoken words. But as I listened to Lily and Max's laughter floating across the yard, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't give up. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many times I felt like I was failing, I would keep trying. Because that's what fathers do. We keep showing up, keep loving, keep hoping. And maybe, just maybe, one day Jake would see that. Maybe one day, we'd find our way back to each other. Until then, I'd be here, ready and waiting, with open arms and an open heart. Because that's what love is. That's what family is. And that's what being a father truly means. I pulled into my driveway at 11:45 p.m., later than usual after my shift at the factory. The streetlights cast an eerie glow over our neighborhood, a constant reminder of why we kept our doors locked at night. As I killed the engine, I let out a deep sigh, replaying the events of the last hour in my mind. It had been a typical Tuesday night, or so I thought. I was driving home, my mind already on the leftover lasagna waiting for me in the fridge, when I spotted her. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, walking alone on the dimly lit sidewalk. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. I'm not usually one to get involved in other people's business, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you'd want to be out alone at night, especially if you were a young woman. Before I knew it, I was slowing down, rolling down my window. "Excuse me, miss?" I called out. She jumped, startled by my voice. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere?" She hesitated, eyeing me warily. I couldn't blame her. I was just some random guy in a car. But after a moment, she nodded. "Yeah, actually, that would be great. I live about 20 minutes from here on foot." I unlocked the doors, and she climbed in. Up close, I could see she was younger than I initially thought, maybe 19 or 20. She smelled faintly of alcohol and cigarettes. "I'm John," I said, trying to put her at ease. "I work the late shift at the factory down on 5th. Where are you headed?" "I'm Melissa," she replied, her voice small. "I live in the apartment complex on Maple Street. Thanks for stopping." I was starting to get really freaked out. As we drove, Melissa opened up a bit. She told me she'd been at a party with some friends from college. Her ride had left without her, and she'd spent nearly an hour trying to find someone sober enough to drive her home. When that failed, she decided to walk, not realizing how far it actually was. "I don't usually do stuff like this," she said, a hint of embarrassment in her voice. "Go to parties on weeknights, I mean. I have an early class tomorrow and everything. God, my mom would kill me if she knew." I chuckled, remembering my own college days. We all do dumb things when we're young. The important thing is you're getting home safe. We chatted a bit more as I navigated the dark streets. Melissa was a nursing student, working part-time at a local coffee shop. She'd grown up in a small town about an hour away and was still adjusting to city life. As we talked, I could see her relax, the tension leaving her shoulders. When we pulled up to her apartment complex, Melissa turned to me with a grateful smile. "Thank you so much, John. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. You're like a guardian angel or something." I waved off her thanks, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Don't worry about it. Just be careful out there, okay? Maybe keep some cab fare on you next time you go out." She nodded, then hesitated. Would you mind waiting until I get inside? Just to be safe?" "Of course," I replied. I watched as she hurried up the walkway, fumbling with her keys for a moment before disappearing into the building. Only then did I put the car in drive and head home. As I walked through my front door, I was greeted by the concerned face of my wife, Sarah. "Where have you been?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I was starting to get worried. I hung up my jacket and gave her a quick kiss. "Sorry, honey. Something came up on the way home. Let me grab a drink and I'll tell you all about it." We settled onto the couch, and I recounted the evening's events. As I spoke, I could see Sarah's expression change from concern to disbelief to something that looked almost like anger. "You did what?" she interrupted, her voice sharp. "John, what were you thinking? Picking up some random girl in the middle of the night?" I blinked, taken aback by her reaction. I was thinking she needed help. "You know how dangerous it can be around here at night." Sarah shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not the point. Do you have any idea how this looks? A married man in his 30s picking up a young woman late at night? What if someone saw you? What if she decides to make up some story about what happened?" "Nothing happened," I protested. "I was just trying to help." "It doesn't matter what actually happened," Sarah shot back. It's about perception. You put yourself in a really vulnerable position. What if her boyfriend saw you drop her off and got the wrong idea? What if she was setting you up for something? I ran a hand through my hair, frustration building. So what, I was just supposed to drive by and leave her there? Pretend I didn't see her? Sarah sighed, her voice softening slightly. I know you meant well, John. But it was still wrong. It was creepy, even if you didn't mean it to be. A man your age shouldn't be offering rides to girls that young. It's inappropriate. We went back and forth for a while, neither of us willing to budge. Sarah insisted I should have called the police if I was really concerned, or at the very least, offered to call a cab for the girl instead of giving her a ride myself. I maintained that I'd done the right thing, given the circumstances. As I lay in bed that night, sleep eluding me, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt Sarah had planted. Had I really done something wrong? I tried to imagine how I'd feel if our daughter, when she's older, accepted a ride from a stranger. The thought made my stomach churn. But then I thought about Melissa, how scared she'd looked walking alone in the dark. I thought about all the horrible things that could have happened to her if the wrong person had come along instead of me. In the end, I decided I could live with being called creepy if it meant she got home safe. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, Sarah stopped me at the door. Her face was softer than it had been the night before, but I could still see the worry in her eyes. I know you were trying to do the right thing, she said, straightening my collar. Just be more careful, okay? Think about how things might look to other people. And maybe we should talk to Katie about party safety when she's a bit older. I nodded, pulling her in for a hug. I hear you. I'll be more mindful in the future. But I still think I did the right thing last night. As I drove to work, I couldn't help but mull over the events of the previous night. I understood Sarah's concerns, I really did. In today's world, you can never be too careful. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes, you have to take a risk to do the right thing. I thought about Melissa, hoping she'd made it to her early morning class okay. I thought about all the other young people out there, making mistakes and finding themselves in potentially dangerous situations. And I thought about my own daughter, how I'd want someone to help her if she was ever in trouble. In the end, I decided that while I'd be more cautious in the future, I couldn't regret my actions. The world can be a dangerous place, especially for young women, and sometimes a little kindness from a stranger can make all the difference. If that makes me creepy in some people's eyes, so be it. I'd rather live with that label than with the knowledge that I'd turned my back on someone in need. As I pulled into the factory parking lot, I made a mental note to talk to Katie about party safety sooner rather than later. And maybe, just maybe, I'd look into some self-defense classes for her too. Because while I hope she never needs to accept help from a stranger, I also hope she grows up to be the kind of person who's willing to offer that help when it's needed. I pulled into my driveway at 11:45 p.m., exhausted from another late shift at the factory. The streetlights cast an eerie glow over our suburban neighborhood, a place that had seen better days. As I turned off the engine, I let out a deep sigh, knowing Sarah would be waiting up for me, probably worried sick. I trudged up to our front door, keys jingling in my hand. As I stepped inside, the warm air enveloped me, a stark contrast to the chilly autumn night outside. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mike, where have you been?" "I was getting worried," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of relief and frustration. I hung up my jacket and turned to face her. "I'm sorry, honey. Something unexpected came up on my way home." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? Did something happen at work?" I shook my head and made my way to the living room, collapsing onto our well-worn couch. Sarah followed, perching on the armchair across from me, her gaze fixed on my face. "No, it wasn't work," I began, running a hand through my thinning hair. "I was driving home, and I saw this girl walking alone on Maple Street. You know how dangerous that area can be at night." Sarah's expression shifted from concern to surprise. "A girl? How old?" "I'm not sure exactly, but definitely younger than us. Maybe early 20s? I paused, gathering my thoughts. "Look, I know it sounds weird, but I couldn't just drive by and leave her there. Our neighborhood isn't what it used to be, Sarah. You know that." My wife's face hardened. "Mike, what did you do?" I took a deep breath. I offered her a ride home. She accepted. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and disappointment clouding her features. I rushed to explain further. She told me she'd been at a party, and her ride left without her. She couldn't find anyone sober enough to drive her home. I couldn't just leave her there, Sarah. What if something had happened to her? Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the small space between the coffee table and the TV stand. Mike, do you have any idea how that looks? A 34-year-old man picking up a young woman in the middle of the night? What were you thinking? I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. I was thinking about her safety, Sarah. You know how many assaults have happened in that area recently. I couldn't live with myself if I found out something had happened to her when I could have prevented it. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. And what about your safety, Mike? What if she had accused you of something? Did you even think about how this could affect us, your job, our reputation in the neighborhood? I nodded slowly. Of course, I thought about it. But in that moment, I decided that the risk to my reputation was worth it if it meant keeping her safe from someone with less pure intentions. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but I could still see the worry etched in the lines around her eyes. She sat back down, this time next to me on the couch. I understand you were trying to do the right thing, Mike, she said softly. But it was still a huge risk. You're not responsible for every person walking alone at night. I took her hand in mine, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin. I know, honey, but I am responsible for my own actions and choices. I chose to help someone in need, even if it meant putting myself at risk. Sarah sighed, squeezing my hand. I just worry about you, about us. The world isn't always kind to good intentions. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling around us. I thought about the young woman I'd driven home, hoping she was safe and sound in her bed now. I thought about all the times I'd wished someone had been there to help me when I was younger and in trouble. Sarah, I said, breaking the silence. I know you're worried, and I understand why. But I want you to know that I'd do it again if I had to. Not because I'm trying to be a hero or anything, but because I believe it's the right thing to do. My wife looked at me, a mix of emotions playing across her face. Finally, she nodded. I know you would, Mike. It's one of the reasons I love you. You always try to do what's right, even when it's not easy. I pulled her into a hug, feeling the tension slowly leave her body. I'm sorry I worried you, I murmured into her hair. As we sat there, holding each other, I couldn't help but reflect on the events of the night. I knew that my decision to help that young woman might be seen as controversial by some, maybe even dangerous. But in a world that often seems cold and uncaring, I believed that small acts of kindness and compassion were more important than ever. The next morning, as I prepared to leave for work, Sarah handed me my lunch bag with a small smile. Be safe out there, she said, her voice softer than usual. And Mike, I'm proud of you for helping that girl, even if it scared me. I kissed her goodbye, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. As I drove to work, I found myself scanning the streets, not out of fear or suspicion, but with a renewed sense of awareness. I realized that night had changed something in me, awakened a desire to be more present, more engaged with the world around me. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes in our neighborhood. People seemed to be looking out for each other more, offering rides, checking in on elderly neighbors. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe my small act of kindness had sparked something larger. One evening, as Sarah and I took a walk around the block, we passed by a group of teenagers hanging out on a street corner. Instead of averting my gaze as I might have done before, I nodded and smiled at them. To my surprise, they smiled back, one of them even waving. You know, Sarah said as we continued our walk, I've been thinking about what you did that night. Maybe we could do more to help make our neighborhood safer. Organize a neighborhood watch or something. I squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of love and pride. That's a great idea, honey. We could talk to the Johnsons next door, see if they'd be interested in helping out. As we walked home under the glow of the streetlights, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. That night, when I'd offered a ride to a stranger in need, I hadn't just helped one person. I'd taken a small step towards creating the kind of community I wanted to live in. One where people looked out for each other, where kindness wasn't seen as weakness, and where doing the right thing was valued above all else. It wasn't always going to be easy, and there would always be risks involved in helping others. But as I looked at Sarah, her face animated as she discussed ideas for improving our neighborhood, I knew that together, we could make a difference. One small act of kindness at a time, we could build a safer, more compassionate world. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us.